Good evening. Good evening. I'm Benjamin F. Chavis Jr., the President and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, the NNPA. 2022. This year we're celebrating the 195th year of the Black Press of America. In just a few minutes, we will have on the Reverend Dr. William Barber II, who's leading a Poor People's Campaign across America to address some of the critical issues affecting the quality of life, not only of African Americans, but all people in the United States. And there's a big march on Washington that the Poor People's Campaign is leading and Reverend Barber is leading, and we're going to talk to him in depth. But while we're waiting for Reverend Barber to come on, I just wanted to greet all of you on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have 230 African American owned newspapers and media companies across the nation. Our executive committee, Karen Carter Richards, is the chair of the NNPA. Janice Ware, the publisher of the Atlanta Voice, is the first vice chair of the NNPA. And I should mention that our chair, Karen Carter Richards, is the publisher of the Forward Times in Houston, Texas. Our second vice chair is Fran Farrer, the publisher of the County News in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our national secretary is Jackie Hampton, of the publisher of the Mississippi Link in Jackson, Mississippi. And our national treasurer is Cheryl Smith, the publisher of the Texas Metro News and the Garland News in Dallas, Texas. We have 5 dynamic African American women who lead the NNPA and the executive committee of our board of directors. So on behalf of all of our board of directors and on behalf of all of our publishers throughout the United States of America, once again, we welcome you to the Black Press of America. 2022 is also a midterm election year. And while we're waiting for Reverend Barber, just let me say, there are too many people in the communities in which we serve who are unregistered to vote. Today, there are some 55 million Americans who are eligible to vote, but who are not registered yet to vote. 55 million. There are elections at state legislatures, congressional districts, governor's races, United States Senate races, House of Representative races on the federal level. And some of these elections are very narrow. Every vote counts. But in order to vote, you have to register to vote. And so at our convention, the NNPA's national convention this year will be in New Orleans, June 22nd through the 25th. And one of the priorities of our convention is to focus on how we're going to get the vote out, GOTV, how we're going to get more people in our community registered to vote, and how we're going to make sure that those who are registered turn out to vote. In some of the early primary states that have already held elections thus far in terms of the primaries, we notice there's been a low voter turnout, an exceedingly low voter turnout. And so all the issues that impact our quality of life, we got to make sure that we will be in place to get our vote out and to mobilize. And I know that's one of the issues that Reverend Barber and I are going to discuss here shortly. I think that also, I want to just say that one of the things that we have to look at is what is going on with all these gun violence in our community. All the police brutality is still persists in our community. It's interesting that the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration, they made a proposal to ban smoking menthol cigarettes, but there's no federal proposal to ban assault weapons. There's no federal proposal to ban access to these deadly weapons. There are too many guns in our community. And so one of the things that we need to talk about is how to balance out public policy and make sure that there are not unintended consequences of bad public policy at the state level, at the federal level, at the regional level. And certainly we need to participate. And of course, I'm going to pause now because the man of the hour is here. One of the great freedom fighters from my home state of North Carolina, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Reverend Barber, welcome to the Black Press of America. So pleased to have you.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Ben, and you know how much I think of you and thank God for you. You knew my father and worked together back in the day. And I'm so glad that you're still working, Doc. You know, this is not a battlefield we can retire from. We just have to fight on until it's our time to be over. So thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you, Reverend Barber. We have people who are listening all over the United States, who are viewing all over the United States in all 50 states. And we're on multiple channels. We're on live stream. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. We're on Twitter. We're Instagram. Some even listening by LinkedIn. Tell us about the Poor People's Campaign. So this is June 2022. Tell us what's supposed to happen in Washington, D.C. and what people need to do to help support this mobilization and how serious things are facing our communities, Reverend Barber.
Well, Ben, there are 5 interlocking injustices that we have yet to fully address in this nation. Systemic racism, whether you look at it through the lens of voter suppression, mass incarceration, the broke immigration system we have, the mistreatment of indigenous people, and even the collateral damage that happens to some of our white brothers and sisters because of racism and disparate treatment of others. Systemic poverty, 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. 60.9% of Black people are poor and or low wealth in this
60%.
country.
Say that again, Dr. Barber.
60.9% of Black people live at or below 200% of the poverty level. That means they are poor and or low wealth. 53% of our people make less than a living wage of $15 an hour right now. And 250,000 people die every year from poverty, 700 people a day before the pandemic. During the pandemic, poor people died at a rate of 2 to 5 times higher, and it is not connected to the lack of vaccination. It's connected to the lack of services. As a report we just did with Howard University, Columbia University, and Jeffrey Sachs found, the pandemic didn't discriminate, but we did. You know, you were the first to report that this pandemic was airborne. People didn't listen to it, you know. And then the other ways in which people were, you know, like for instance, 50% of the people in the Bronx are service workers. Well, they were suddenly turned to essential workers during the pandemic, meant they had to go to work, but they were forced to go to work without health care, without living wages, and without the medical protections that they should have had. But there are 3 others: ecological devastation, denial of health care. 87 million people in this country either uninsured or underinsured, many of them Black, majority of them Black in our community. 4 million families get up every morning, can buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water. The war economy, where right today, Ben, we are spending 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy, and that is military contractors primarily. They're making money. One military contract from Boeing could pay for every southern state that has denied Medicaid expansion. Think about that. Just one contract. Not if we cut the military budget into $350 billion, which is half, we would still have more money in our military than Iran, Iraq, China, and North Korea combined. And then, of course, this false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white supremacy. So what we've said is on June 18th, it is time for a declaration of all people. We won't be silent anymore. We're calling for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls to put a face on all of these numbers, to put an agenda, a third Reconstruction agenda before the nation, and to build power and to shift this moral narrative, because poor people now represent 32% of the electorate in this country and 45% in battleground states. So we're telling everybody to come 9:30 on Pennsylvania Avenue, Pennsylvania and 3rd, for the mass poor people's low wage workers assembly mall march on Washington and to the polls. If you believe that we need everybody tackling these 5 interlocking injustices together, not just in silos, but we need you, whoever you are, whatever color you are, to challenge this. And this is led by poor people. Poor people and impact people will be the major voices on the stage, saying that
Yes.
we won't be silent anymore and we won't be unorganized anymore.
Barbara, give out that. That's Saturday, June 18th.
Saturday, June 18th at 9:30 a.m. on Pennsylvania Avenue between the Congress and the White House. The Congress in the background, because what we're saying is, let me give you an example. Last year, Manchin and Sinema and 49 Republicans voted to block passing a federal living minimum wage of $15. Now, what the media, you picked it up in black media, but a lot of folk didn't pick it up. That was a quote unquote racist vote. You say, well, what do you mean racist? Well, racism is about disparate treatment toward people because of the color of their skin, or a policy that impacts black people. When those 2 Democrats joined with the Republicans and voted to block living wages, then they blocked 53% of our people from coming up out of poverty and low wealth. One block, one vote. If that had passed, 53% of black people who make less than a living wage of $15 would have come out of poverty and low wealth with one piece of public policy. That's why we have to come together and fight to make these policies a reality.
I know that you've been all over the United States, Reverend Barber, and I've just checked in with some of my home counties there in North Carolina, and I'm pleased to report to you that Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife, they're organizing buses already out of Guilford County to come up to Washington, D.C. on Saturday, June 18th. But to share with the audience, what has been the responsiveness of people, not only in the South, in Appalachia, and in the Northeast, Northwest, the South, all regions of the country, how are people responding to the call for the Poor People's March, the Poor People's Campaign?
You know, it's something when an idea whose time has come. You know, Dr. King said in '68, about 24 hours before he was murdered, nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And then, let's be honest, we've not really pushed poverty and dealing with poverty into the public square. We don't hear it in our public policy.
I was going to say, I've heard some even hear the term used, poverty.
You don't even hear the term used. And yet it's 43% of the nation being. 43% of Americans are poor and low wealth. 52% of our children. 30% of white people, which is actually 66 million people. 73 million women. Over 68 million men, 68% of Latino, and you have entire political seasons go, and nobody says anything about poor and wealth and poverty. You have a presidential election, and nobody asks the question: if you elect the president, how are you going to? What policies are going to impact poor and low wealth people? So the response has been overwhelming. We now have 43 coordinating committees from states, because we built this from the bottom up. You know, we've been planning this over 3 years. We had planned to do it in 2020, and then COVID hit. And we went online, and 3 million people showed up online. We have now buses and planes and trains coming from every state, even Hawaii and Alaska. We have over 350 organizing partners, over 50 religious organizations. For instance, just this morning we had a press conference, the executive committee of the Episcopal Church that said, we're calling all Episcopals to come, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the Unitarians, the Reformed Jews, many of our other brothers, Hindus, Muslims. And we have the big unions, all of them, the SEIU, ASCME are all in, the AFL-CIO all in. But even more than that, the new groups, like the people fighting for union rights at Dollar General and Starbucks and Amazon and Maximus, the call centers down in the Deep South, they are all saying it's time for us to come together. Because here's the bottom line, being what we've been teaching. It's all right to do our work in silos sometimes. For instance, Black folk have to take on voter suppression because it's the first people hit by us. But we also must recognize that the current laws that are being passed to suppress the vote will hurt 22 million Americans, not just Black Americans, 22 million Americans. So if the same people that are blocking living wages are blocking voting rights, and the same people blocking a woman's right to choose are blocking health care, and the same people blocking fixing the climate are blocking people having access to clean water. At some point, you've got to have a gathering, a movement that says, why don't we all come together and stand against these forces that are standing against us?
Well, Barber, you've like you say, you've been working on this now for a number of months, years. You've pulled together probably the largest single coalition of various groups, Blacks, Latinos, Native American, Asian Americans, white Americans. You said you got all the religious groups that have agreed to come together, all the trade union groups, all the civil rights groups. Talk to us about Generation Z and the millennials. Are young people responding to the call for action around the agenda to eliminate poverty?
Well, you know, one of the great blessings in the midst of all this is the young people that are in the mix, not on the side. In fact, she was beat on the Edmonds Pettus Bridge, Boyington. Her nephew,
Amelia Boynton, yes.
Boynton, is leading the youth effort. Isn't that something? Her nephew is leading, one of the leading organizers. And what's amazing to me is the young folk actually buy into this moral fusion coming together. The environmentalists getting in the ring with the people fighting for living wages. And a lot of the living wage people are young. You know, a lot of the fast food workers, they are young. Yeah. And so they are actually teaching me and teaching us. I'm moved by the numbers of them that are coming in, but I'm also moved by the fact on June 18th, now it's not going to be William Barber giving a big speech on behalf of poor people. It's going to be poor, low-wealth people speaking for themselves. But what that stage is going to look like then is you're going to have, for instance, a young, say, African-American fast food worker from Carolina on the stage with a white farmer from Kentucky, where the white farmers are talking about Kansas, farmers committing suicide because of poverty. And you're going to have these Black fast food workers united together. And both groups saying, listen, we want this 14-point moral agenda. We're putting out a 14-point moral agenda for the healing of the nation. And that's what's powerful in this regard. And it's not easy. I'm not suggesting. Some people aren't with this. Some people say, I don't want to work in coalition with other folks. But what we found through history is always somebody has to take up this moral fusion where everybody will not do it. Frederick Douglass understood that if he stood against slavery, but he also had to stand against the mistreatment of Chinese workers. Sojourner Truth understood she stood against slavery, but she also had to stand with white women in the women's suffrage movement, even though she knew at first Black women wouldn't benefit. But they understood the power of moral fusion coalition building, where we unite our struggles together. And I think we're in a moment now where we need to have a massive lamenting and crying out. That's a very biblical term. But all these tears need to become a flood of transformation. We don't need to cry just to be crying. We need to cry in a way that strengthens our call and our fight and our struggle. And none of this stuff being is really radical. If you think about it, there are 25, for instance, of the wealthiest countries in the world. All of them offer some form of universal health care except for the United States. Right? We haven't raised the minimum wage for 12 years. That's ridiculous, right? Last year, a group of Nobel Peace Prize economists said raising the minimum wage would not hurt prices, would not affect. In fact, not raising the minimum wage and keeping people in poverty is one of the factors that makes the society more susceptible to inflation. And so we're hurting ourselves. It costs us $1 trillion a year to not fix child poverty. If we raise the minimum wage to 15, we would pump $330 billion into the economy. So the things we're talking about are not radical, they're just right. They're right,
Yes.
they're just, they're loving, and it makes sense.
Well, it's June 6th, and of course, we have 12 days before June 18th. How do people
right.
get in touch? People who want to sign up, people who want to find out where the buses are, where the trains are in every state. Is there a central number or a central website? How do people go get the information so they can participate and support the June 18th March on Washington?
www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, poorpeoplescampaign/June18th.org. And you can get everything there, buses, organizations that are involved, how to get here, how to come. This is our cry is we won't be silent anymore. The 140 million poor and low wealth people can't be silent anymore. And then let me tell you one other thing as we close that you were just talking about voting. You know, the pundits are telling us the midterms are going to turn out this way. You know, what they do is take your watch and tell you what time it is. They don't look at what if a mass number of poor and low wealth people started voting. Well, we are. And what we found is two lies that we can't believe anymore. That is that the majority of poor white folk vote against their own interests. The data doesn't show that. The data shows most people, poor people don't vote. Number two, it shows that most of them don't vote because nobody talks to them. The candidates don't talk to them. They don't recruit them. They don't let them know how they're going to be impacted. But here's the third thing. In 15 states, then, if poor and low wealth people just voted between 1 and 25% of those already registered, they could change the outcome of every election. In Michigan, it's 1%. In Florida, it's 4%. In Georgia, it's 7%. In North Carolina, it's 19%. Not even 20% of poor and low wealth people that are already registered to vote, regardless of their color, if they voted around their own agenda, if they voted around what matters to them, they could determine the Senate races, they could determine governor's races, they could determine presidential races. So we're leaving DC. We're not, it's DC, it's the Moral March on Washington and to the polls, because the day after it, we're going to work to mobilize like never before in poor and low wealth communities, especially in those states where you have massive Senate races that could change the look of the United States Senate, and races where you could fundamentally shift how the Congress looks.
Well, that's a good segue. Listen, the Black Press, we will be there on June 18th, not just to witness history in its making, but also to be an advocate for what you're doing, Reverend Barber, and the Poor People's Campaign, and this moral fusion. I just want to go back. I want you to amplify this point about the difference between Chronos time and Kairos time. I remember in South Africa when Nelson Mandela, people were underestimating whether or not the people in South Africa, given a chance to vote, would go out and vote. And of course, you know what happened in 1994. They had a 99% voter turnout in South Africa. Because it was Kairos time. Can you explain to our audience the difference between Chronos time and Kairos time?
Well, you know, Chronos is just man-ordered time. It's already structured Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. But Kairos is when time gets interrupted by truth. Time gets interrupted by love. Time gets interrupted by God. Time gets interrupted by the Spirit. We have a Pentecost, if you will. And I think if we have a moral Pentecost in America, we can fundamentally shift what is happening. Things don't have to be as they have always been. You know, today we had a press conference and we said to the president, "What you need to meet with poor and low wealth folk. If you're pushing an agenda, say for living wages, you need to have the folk that need the living wages pushing the agenda, not just meeting with businesses and Congress folk. We got to change the moral narrative. And that's when you do that, that's a kind of a Kairos moment. You know, when you can move from how much does it cost to do this to how much does it cost us to leave things like they are. Actually, that's what Nobel Peace Prize economist Joseph Stiglitz said America ought to be asking. He said, we're asking the wrong question. Every time we want to do something, well, how much does it cost? Well, I mean, no, how much is it costing us to leave it like it is? And so this is a Kairos moment. Now, people who are in the office, politicians need to understand it. See, in a Kairos moment, you don't have one vote on voting rights and then quit. What you do is you keep having those votes and carry that battle right into the election. We should have another vote on August the 6th, the anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, on the John Lewis bill, on the Voting Rights Act. Whether it passes or not, we should push it. We should have a vote on living wages on the day after Labor Day, and force people to say where they are, show where they stand, and push those issues right into their election, so that people will look at these Senate candidates through the lens of where do they stand on voting rights, where do they stand on living wages, where do they stand on healthcare, the real issues that matter in people's lives. I believe this is one of those Kairos moments. I've seen folk come together. Ben, I was in Appalachia, out in the rain, and I saw all these Appalachians standing in front of mansions, dirty coal mine, welcome me like a brother. And then the next day, they had Palm Sunday. I was preaching Palm Sunday in front of Joe Manchin's dirty coal plant, way back up in the hills. And these folk are coming together that have never come together. That's why I know something's happening, which is why we can't just believe what these paid pundits say. We've got to mobilize, because movements can always change what the pundits have already predicted is going to happen.
Exactly. You know, our former colleague in the freedom struggle and civil rights movement, the Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian, once defined movement as people moving. People moving. That's what a movement is. And it seems to me that the mobilization for June 18th is a movement. And you're indicating that you're going to continue to move, continue to get people moving, even after the 18th. You know, I agree with you. All these pundits who are predicting low voter turnout and predicting that the right wing is going to take over everything. Of course, if we allow that to happen, but we're not going to allow that. We're not going to allow that to happen. You know, and
if you can't tell if poor folk represent 32% of the electorate, it's and 45% in battleground state. It's not what they're going to do; it's what you're going to allow. That's the question. So we have to stop letting people say we don't have power, we can't do something. The other thing I want your audience to know now, there are 5 steps to massive nonviolent civil disobedience. On June 18th, we're going to finish the last 2 before the 5th step, which is massive nonviolent civil disobedience. That is making sure your issues are moral, and number 2, making sure your adversaries know exactly what you want. And we're going to give this country about 2 years to act on some of this stuff and show good faith. If it doesn't, people are prepared in 2 years in cities, in states, from the legislatures to engage in massive, nonviolent, loving, but truthful protests. Because what we can't do is allow this death to keep happening. I want your audience to hear this. When we talk about poverty, we're talking about 700 people dying a day from poverty, 250,000 people a year, needlessly. Now, 7 people died from vaping, you know, that smoke stuff they do. And we had congressional hearings. We had presidential meetings. You said the FDA shut down menthol, put a ban on some things.
They're trying to, but ain't nobody talking about banning assault weapons.
Banning poverty that's unnecessary.
There's something wrong with that. Why are we banning poverty? I think the government's got mixed up, and that's why I'm joining with law enforcement people around the country to oppose the menthol ban, because it's just another unintended consequences where people who think they're doing right wind up hurting the people who they think they're acting in behalf of.
Yeah, so we've got work to do, and we can do this. And one of the things I've found, Ben, is helping people understand the power that we actually have, and particularly if we can break free of our solo. We were doing an analysis today of all of the groups that have signed up to mobilize, plus our coordinating committees. Together, they have a reach of about 80 million people.
That's great.
80 million people that they could reach through social media, through email. That's just in the group that said, yes, we're going to mobilize with you. We have to use this mobilization to launch an entire summer of mobilization and voter registration and voter education, and refuse to allow the extremists to take over, and refuse to allow moderate Democrats to think they can keep controlling the agenda, and suggesting that a moderate position is blocking living wages. A moderate position is blocking healthcare. That's not moderate. That's political madness. That's what that
Exactly.
is.
Exactly. And I know your time is valuable. Before I got to ask you this, because you and I both are in the movement. We come out of the movement, been in the movement all of our lives. Your father, man, was one of the greatest freedom fighters I had ever been blessed to meet and work with. But I'm going to ask you now about our traditional civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the Urban League, Reverend Sharpton's Action Network. In fact, I'm going to be on Reverend Sharpton's show tomorrow,
Great.
opposing the menthol ban. But I want to know, and again, this is a question because I want to see the kind of unity that needs to take place among all of our organizations. Are all the traditional civil rights organizations, are they chiming in? Are they supporting the Poor People's Campaign? Are we going to see that kind of unity on June 18th?
Well, I don't know. I know that Reverend Sharpton has been kind and has shared the information many times, been a supporter. Marielle has written about it. I've seen op-eds. We have not heard from the NAACP in terms of being a partner or pushing out. But you know what? This is where I am. I am doing all we can, and I tell folk I'm working with anybody who's about
Yes.
going forward. I'm
Yes.
not participating with anybody that's about division. And what I will say to all of our groups, and I said this when I was in Selma recently, you know, everybody talks about the big lie, the Trump, and how it's promoted voter suppression. But we need to repent a little bit, me included, all of us in the civil rights community, because the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013.
Yes.
In 2014, we went right back to Selma and had a commemoration. In 2015, we went right back to Selma and had a commemoration. What we should have done is launched a movement and re-engaged, because what had been won was taken from us. My outcry to all of the organizations is simply this: if 60.9% of Black people are poor and or low wealth, how can that not be a centerpiece in any agenda for Black people? How
Exactly.
can not addressing poverty not be a centerpiece? If Black folks are dying from poverty and the lack of health care, we cannot allow ourselves to be focused on one issue. You know, I was asked by a white congressperson last year if the Poor People's Campaign would talk about voting rights but not connect voting rights and living wages. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. He says, you know, normally we that's not put together. I said, well, that's the problem. That's part of the problem. So what I'm saying to all the brothers and sisters, it's not too late. People are coming from all of those organizations you mentioned. We're
Yes.
all together. But you got to be also open to fusion if you're going to be with the Poor People's Campaign. Some people aren't open to fusion. And what we're saying, you got to be open. I'm not going to push my indigenous brothers and sisters away, or my Appalachian brothers and sisters away, or my LGBTQ brothers and sisters away, or any other folk, just so that somebody else will feel comfortable. It's all of us, not just some of us.
Exactly. Well, Reverend Barber, we salute you. We thank God for you. We are grateful for the movement of people that you have mobilized for June 18th. And we look forward to continuing. I know right after June 18th, all the Black press, we're going to be down in New Orleans at our national convention, June 22nd through the 25th. And everything that comes out of June 18th is going to be on our agenda, Reverend Barber. I would assure
I
you,
know it
as
will.
well as absolutely. And I've even talked to the Transformative Justice Coalition. It turns out there are 55 million unregistered voters in America. All 55 million unregistered. 55 million.
Mm.
I mean, we wouldn't have to be worried about these far right wing politics if everybody could get registered to vote. Our democracy is at stake. You know, January 6th is just the tip of an iceberg, and these
That's all
people,
it is.
you know, while repentance is good for the soul, reparations is good for the spirit, and I think
That's
that
right.
this engagement that you've launched. And I'm glad that you're making it. I like that idea of the fusion. That's that. I see. You know, my background. I was a chemist for going to work with Dr. King.
I know it.
And
That's right.
when you put these elements together, when you fuse, you come out with something that's greater. We're greater in unity than separate and apart.
That's
You
right.
know, we're more
What did they
powerful.
say, Ben? What they say? Hydrogen alone can kill you. Pure
right.
oxygen alone can kill you. But
But
mixed together,
H2O, you get water.
nobody can live without it. Nobody can live
Nobody
without
can
it.
live without H2O. That's right.
That's right.
So, you know, but unfortunately, you know, we live in a world that's against science. They don't believe they don't believe in the science. They don't believe in climate change. They don't believe. But you know, that there again, I'm so glad you're seizing the moral authority. And sometimes the morality has to be embraced and seized by the people who are impacted by those that don't have no morals. You know, I think it's just awful what happened in Texas. And I'll just end on this point. We can close out the interview. But Reverend Bob, was one of the saddest days of my life. I had to speak at the funeral of our beloved sister in Buffalo, New York. Sister Massey, Catherine Massey. She was 72 years old. She worked for the Buffalo Challenger, one of our black newspapers. And sister was not only a journalist, but she went to the store, not only to shop, but to drop off some newspapers. The guy shot her through the window, didn't kill her at first, but then went over to her and made sure that he killed her, shot her in the head. Now, this kind of hatred, man, you know, in Buffalo, hatred in Texas, hatred all over America. We got to do something about it. I think the people who are elected to make these laws, Reverend Barber, at the state level, at the federal level, they have to be held accountable, you know,
right.
by the people. A democracy exists for the people. It doesn't exist just for those who are elected. And I think that, you know, I don't want to start preaching. You got me ready to preach, but I just want to thank you for this interview. And I want you to know that the black press, the black church, the black community, working with all of that, the fusion elements that you've brought together in the Poor People's Campaign, we support you 100%. And on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, we thank you.
Thank you. God bless you. See everybody on the 18th. We won't be silent anymore. God bless you.
God bless.